Welcome down to my 9-foot homemade oak bar. Pour yourself a cold one. You are listening to Bucks in the Basement. My name's Chris, and Craig here is the biggest Pirates fan you'll ever meet. Let's talk Pirates baseball now. Welcome to Bucks in the Basement.
Now I see the changes in this town. They change, they say one thing, but then the next day it's different. They change, but they don't know what they want. All they do is change. Going left, going right, travel day, travel night. That's where we'll go. No excuses, no goodbyes, no one cries, no more lies. We'll never know.
You know, seriously, when are you going to have those guys like play live? Like, you need to have at least one episode where they're actually there and they're playing. And it doesn't need to be like the full band. Like, you could have a guy singing, and you could have a guy strumming, and you could have a guy like blowing into the top of a jug. Like, it's like one of those things you see on a porch down in Georgia in the wild. But I mean, and that would probably go really well with that song. But I feel like that's something you should be striving for. How are you? I haven't seen you in a while.
I know, man. We were talking before this. I've been like super busy. Went out to St. Louis to visit the family. Got in a college tour, the first college tour for my oldest. She's going to be a senior next year. Work usually I can. My work is extremely flexible, and the one day it wasn't. Had some good guests: Jason Mackey, John Wayner, but been looking forward to this to get back and just having a back and forth with you about spring training, man. It's hope springs eternal, but for the Pirates fans, anger comes in waves because news comes out all the time that makes people mad and really can't enjoy stuff, and half of the games aren't on TV, so you're listening to the radio and following along on Statcast. So
You know what my philosophy about spring training and how I try to watch it is I take a look at my 26 man, I take a look at my 40 man, I take a look at guys that aren't on the 40 man that could fight their way onto it because they're going to make the team your non-roster invitees. And then I'll sit there and say, okay, well then who's probably losing a job? I'll look at position battles that are realistic. I won't put a lot of stock into how a guy is hitting in the first couple of weeks in spring training, right? And just try to look at everything as it's warm-ups, right? I mean, you're going to have pitchers that are come out, look impressive, but if they're only pitching 1 or 2 innings, do you really know, especially with young guys, how they're going to fare for 6? And you're not going to find that out with most of them. Like, this news comes out that Paul Skenes is not starting with the team. It makes perfect sense to me because they weren't in a big hurry to give him a bunch of innings. They weren't really ramping him up in that way. I don't think I ever expected him to break camp with the team. I would like to see him show up early on and be able to contribute, but you're going to put a lot of innings on a young arm if you start him out at the beginning of the year. So baby him. Do what the Dodgers are doing right now with Walker Buehler, who is healthy, but he's coming out of an injury. He hasn't put that many innings on his arm, and he's a professional baseball player. And they're not even planning on having him pitch any games until the very end of spring training. And they're going to extend him out because they're allowed to. And they're going to ease him in to finally pitching because they want him to pitch meaningful games late. And if this works out the way it could for the Pirates, and I loved what I saw Brian Reynolds talk about on MLB Network, where he was like, we got a good team and we're going to make some noise this year and we think we're good. If it does turn into something like that, you want Paul Skenes showing up and being able to pitch the way he's capable of pitching from the moment he gets up until the season ends. You don't want him, like, you don't want to hear about dead arm. You don't want to hear like we put too much on this young guy and he might not be able to pitch in September. You want him eased into it and innings available for when he gets up, he's ready to perform. So I totally get that move, Craig.
yeah, and I look back to, I mean, there was two things that stuck out in my mind, which was Steven Strasburg back in 2012 got to about 150 innings, had an innings cap on him. The team was making the playoffs,
Yeah.
and they shut him down.
I remember that. And that was, let's be honest, that was, I'm sure there's a little bit of what if with fans of that organization and with that organization. When you look at how things went with him and how eventually, in the end, all the babying in the world didn't stop him from being injury prone. Like the what if of the whole thing, like maybe we should have just kept going with the guy. Maybe we shouldn't have started him on time. And so again, that's what you don't want to run into that problem. And you have enough arms to get out of the gate and be able to pitch and be able to compete. And if things go the way that they could go, and again, I do like this roster. I do think that this is the first time that the Pirates have had a roster in a long time they could get out of the gate and actually sustain it. I know last year it was like, ooh, look at this, lightning in a bottle, but it wasn't sustainable. This team has the ability, if they go out there, they don't kick the ball around, they play solid defense, they do some situational hitting, but also they've got some real ball players on the team. And they've actually put some professional pitchers in the rotation, even though they're not the high end ones that you wish that Bob Nutting would spend on. This team in this division could make some noise. And you would love to see a Skenes join the rotation and a Ben Charrington before the trade deadline able to use all this capital that he has in terms of prospects to go out and grab a player, whether it be a pitcher or a hitter, to put in the middle of his lineup that makes a difference for that second half run. And I'm sure that's how they're looking at it too. And that's why you don't rush a guy like Skenes out of the gate.
No, and even a couple years ago, they sent Rowanzi Contreras, back down to the minors in 2022, and gave him a couple weeks off, and then had him build himself back up to kind of finish the season. Because even with like some pitchers, they've talked about the fact that they like to like finish the season and then start the off season on a normal schedule, and not be, what it would probably be. I'm thinking if he's up there at the beginning of the year, and it could happen even if he starts in the minors, is that you're getting towards like August and something, and they're like, okay, he got to 150 innings, he's done. And that's where like people will in one breath complain that they had Johan Oviedo go about 24 innings over that like threshold, the 150 innings, and now he's getting Tommy John surgery. To then, if they shut down Paul Skenes, they will talk out the other side of their mouth and be like, we should just let him pitch. I mean, you want to be cautious with this arm. This is a year where, Ben Charrington has said he wanted to compete, but that also doesn't mean that competing stops at the end of this season. I mean, you're looking forward to what Paul Skenes can do in 2025, 26, 27, 28. I mean, it's partially about 2024, but with a guy like this, I mean, I don't think you're going to go all in with his arm and say, okay, here's a load like Mitch Keller took last year of like 194 innings, and we even saw him wear down because he had been built up, year after year after year, and started in September where it was like one of his, worst months. So, I mean, I knew he was going to be down in the minors. Everybody's saying AAA Indianapolis. I'm waiting for the complete blowback when I honestly think that it could even be in Double A in Altoona where he finished last season. I mean, people are going to lose their absolute mind.
Where does it matter where he pitches
It
if he's
doesn't.
getting his innings and his work in at this point? He doesn't even need to go to AAA, and if he's there, it could be a short stint. I wouldn't get excited about that. I do get why fans are frustrated because the real frustration may be in the fact that they should have made one more pitching move as a team. They really should have. Okay, I mean Mitch Keller is a guy that on some teams is not the ace. On some teams, he is the ace because he happens to be the best guy. Martin Perez is not. I mean, he's probably two or three, probably your two right now. He's not that on most teams. Marco Gonzalez is like a fifth starter on most teams. Ortiz and Contreras really should be fighting for the spot against each other. And instead, the two of them, I mean, both of them, at least right now, when I look at like projections, would be rounding out that rotation. They should have had another name in there that slotted in the two or the three spot and bumped a few guys down, added a little bit of competition. And that may be where the frustration is because when you didn't see them do that, you're like, oh, maybe Paul Skenes is going to be making the team, right? That changes the whole rotation, doesn't it? but that's not what they're doing. So maybe some of the frustration is the fact that you're one move short. And trust me, we said that on this show all off season, the amount of starters that they needed to sign, they're one short. And so if they do get out of the gate and struggle, if they do have a problem with the rotation early, point the spotlight right at Ben Charrington and his owner, who's cheap, and say that's the reason there should have been one more starting pitcher added in. Because you are not blocking Paul Skenes or anybody else by adding arms. The cream rises to the top, and those other arms eat innings to provide for those guys later on when they do force their way onto the team to be fresh and ready to go. You do not win anything with 5 arms in your rotation that are available. And that's kind of how it feels right now. And I think that you're just a little light in terms of who's a capable starter that can go out and win ball games for you instead of somebody who's just a bridge to your long relief out of the bullpen.
Yeah, we've came out and said a couple of times that Martin Perez and Marco Gonzalez were fine, like in a vacuum, but we were more towards signing a guy for a couple years, because if not, if there's injuries, some guys don't, come up and perform right away, then you're going to be looking at, a possible similar situation, maybe not as dire, hopefully not as dire, because you'll have, Mitch Keller, definitely, he got his extension. You'll have Paul Skenes. You'll have, hopefully JT Brubaker coming back, Mike Burrows coming back, but those aren't even guarantees either. So you'll be like in more of a similar situation. So that's why we tossed out, a Clevenger or a Lorenzen.
Yeah, I mean,
For a
and that's the
couple
thing. Like,
years.
why isn't one of those guys? Why didn't you sign one of those guys for multi years? They're still sitting out there. What are their contract demands really? What is the contract demand for Mike Clevenger, who's getting paid a bunch of money to not play for the White Sox this year because his contract was set up where he I think he got 8 million, and then it was like a $4 million buyout. So he's already got 4 million in his pocket this year. Sorry, I think he's getting something like 4. It might be 5 that he's already got in his pocket this year. And you're telling me you couldn't work out a deal to add another arm into your rotation? I'm sure his salary demand is not something you can't handle with your really low payroll, even with the cheapskate owner. So and Lorenzen would be a great multi-year signing, because here's the thing: what do the Pirates have so special that you can't bring in a guy for a couple of years who's going to block it? Do they really have behind Mitch Keller 4 can't miss pitchers in their system right now that we know they're going to be in there and they're going to perform at a high level, so we can't sign somebody to a 3-year deal? It's a mismanagement of whatever you were given by the owner. I always try to judge my general manager off of the idea that the owner's only giving him so much. But whatever that was given to Ben Charrington, he needed to stretch his dollar to be able to get that one more pitcher into the rotation. If he wanted to compete this year, that would have gone a long way. I'm not saying they can't. Again, there's a lot of positives of this team. I think it's going to be the best summer that you've seen in Pittsburgh in a while, mainly because of how bad the other summers have been. So, I mean, the bar is low. But I mean, like, you would feel more confident if you would have gotten the right amount of arms. And I don't think the right amount of arms were added to the starting rotation.
No, and that's where we've kind of been like this entire off season, and you're talking about like adding to a payroll, which right now the estimates with all the ARB numbers in there have seen the top of it being right around like $81 million, which we talked about $100 million.
Pitiful. It's pitiful.
Yeah,
$81 million is pitiful and embarrassing. Boo Bob nutting at every turn.
and I definitely agree with that. And they do the right things in certain ways where they've, like I talked about before, they extended Mitch Keller, they've extended Brian Reynolds, they've extended Brian Hayes. None of them to outrageous deals. A lot of them described once again as team friendly deals. I mean, a lot of people will look at the numbers of Mitch Keller's extension and their eyeballs will pop out of their heads, just because in his final year in 2028 he will get $20 million. That's not something that Pirates fans are used to seeing. I mean, his number doesn't change this year, other than how the signing bonus is structured. His signing bonus is a little over $2.2 million, but you saw pitchers this year, even next year he's getting 15 million. You saw a lot of pitchers who weren't very high level pitchers and were, risky pitchers, the ones we've talked about in like a Lance Lynn, a Kyle Gibson, a Flaherty. I mean, Sean Manaea, we've thrown out there. Like, they weren't much more than that. So I really, in some ways, it's not super team friendly, but it kind of is, because you don't know, what the market's going to look like, in a couple years when Mitch Keller was set to be a free agent. But I mean, they've done some of the right things. It's just like, could you just do that one more thing to kind of push this, over the top just a little bit? If you ever see me out and about in Pittsburgh, you will always recognize me, and not just because of the white beard, but also because of the Y that is always on top of my head, the hat I always wear. The Yins brand, proud partners with Bucks in the Basement. 3 dynasties, 1 brand, Yins. Finally, 1 brand to rep all black and gold. Follow at Shop Yins for new merch drops and giveaways. Order online at www.shopyins, the emphasis on the 2 Z's, high quality comfort, lightweight materials, a new modern look for the black and gold, made for Yins by a Yinzer.
If somebody would have asked me, would you rather spend $10.5 million this year on another starting pitcher or spend it on Aroldis Chapman, I would say another starting pitcher.
100%.
100%. Okay. And I think that at this point, at this stage, with the guys that are available out there who cannot find a job, you could do that. And you could find somebody effective enough to at least bounce your 4th and 5th starters down a slot. And possibly, looking ahead at what you're going to spend over the next couple of years, a guy like Lorenzen, I think if he walks in, is at least the 3. If you made that move, you could make that argument that he's at least the 3 on this current rotation. If he comes in and you move everybody down, you make the whole rotation better. I'd much rather have you spend your money there. And that's the thing. I'm always interested in what a GM is doing, because he's got to work within whatever his owner's doing. And you never know what that price tag is. You wish that they would put it out there, right? Wouldn't it be amazing if it was like the owner came out and said, this year, my budget is X amount of dollars. And now as fans, we sit there and go, well, I would go spend this, I would go spend that. And you kind of figure, but you're never going to get that, right?
Yeah.
So at the end, though, when we look back on what Cherington spent the money on, you can then question, why did you spend it on Chapman when you needed more in your starting rotation? I understand the owner loves Kutch, but the $5 million he's making this year could have gone somewhere else to address a more pressing need than him. I understand the fans love him, but between Chapman and Kutch, I got 15.5 right now that I could use someplace else. And Grandal, even though it was only $2.5 million, at the exact same time in the exact same week, I'm watching guys sign minor league deals who are about as valuable as Yasmani Grandal. And so you could have gotten creative there and saved yourself a couple mil as well, because you would have signed. And now you find the money to address the issue you need to address. And that's when you can be critical of a general manager. I don't like piling on a guy when it's not his fault with the money. But when I see how the money was spent in the end, yes, by all means, you can sit there and say, I would have spent that differently. Let's see if I'm right when we're sitting here midway through the season or at the end of the season and we go, man, it would have been nice if we would have had something else. Because to me, that's my gut instinct looking at this roster and the payroll. If this is what your payroll is going to be, you misspent some of the funds.
Yeah, and that's where, like, getting into this, I mean, you're talking about Grandal, you're talking about Kutch. For me, that conversation always goes directly to Henry Davis. And it's not even so much Grandal, but it's Kutch. Because we talked about on this program previously, we talked about Adley Rutschman. I brought up how he, in the same way as a pitcher is innings are piled up year by year. The same thing happened with Adley Rushman, is that, it was like 80 some games. And then it was like 100 and some games. And then it was, 110 is I think what he topped out at. But they still had like those 40 some games at the DH that they, had that stuff going. Well, even this year, with all the conversations going on surrounding whether or not Grandal's the starter, uh, Derek Shelton could never answer that question good enough for everybody, because he either says there's another spot or there's the C2, and now the C2 is now catch. They're saying it's that now it is like, a depth chart. Well, he's still saying catcher too. He's just, we have one catcher, we have a second catcher, and then at the end of that quote, he calls it a tandem, basically because he says that Grandal's not going to catch 100 games. He says it's going to be a tandem. To me, at that point in time, split it down the middle, 81-81, because I'm not expecting Henry Davis to catch 100 games either, when it took Adley Rushman to build up over 3 years to get over the 100-game mark. So,
Well, when I listen to that, I also wonder how much of that is trying to massage the ego of a veteran who is no longer what he used to be in Grandal, but may think he is. And you also are aware that his injury history suggests that he's really not going to get a ton of games. So you're kind of saying, oh, no, like we're going to give a ton of games, and both of these guys are going to be doing this much. When deep down you're like, yeah, but Grandal isn't going to be able to do that much, right? But we have to say it that way, because if we told him that he's purely the catcher too, he would be disgruntled. Because I mean, I'm not saying he is. I don't know him, right? I'm just looking at a guy that I've noticed him over the last couple of years, and I've kind of and he strikes me, at least personally, as the kind of veteran that's going to be like, wait, hold on a second, I'm Yasmani Grandal, like I'm catcher one, right? Like, that's, and the management and anybody evaluating him is like, nah, he's really not. And I don't know if I would even platoon him based upon the fact that he's a switch hitter who has more power from one side than the other side, and he's always dealing with back issues and knee problems. He probably won't get the games in anyway. So can we just act like he's going to? And then that way he's happy. And we all know the reality is that he's not actually going to get that many games. I don't know. I don't know if that's true, but I mean, I do think of that when I listen to how they're presenting it. Like, wow, everybody here is going to play all kinds of games. But deep down, they know that guy isn't going to be able to go for that many games, because he hasn't been able to for several years now.
and I still don't rule out the possibility of Jason DeLay sticking on the team as the third catcher, and it gets broken down the way I think we talked about it. I don't know how long ago it was at this point now, because we haven't recorded in a few weeks together, but it was like a 40-40-20 split where Jason DeLay gets some of those games, because you also want to, like I said, ease Henry Davis. And it's not even about his catching ability. It's about the wear and tear that the catching is on young players.
Well,
It
that's great, but if you
happens.
do that, then Davis has to go stand in the outfield for a certain amount of games, because you're shortening your bench by carrying three catchers.
Yeah, but I mean, even if you carry the two catchers and Davis's bat, which is actually the more important part, because here's this whole conversation of what's going on here goes away. And I mean, obviously, Henry Davis has three like ticker tape home runs so far in spring training and like 15 at bats. So it's just like the tagline of "That's my catcher two, that's my C2" or whatever. My big thing is that you could take he could catch 80 games if his bat plays, and then you get like 50 games at the DH. But then if you have Kutch at that DH spot,
And there it is. That I was waiting to say it, but you got to it naturally. He doesn't make any sense on this roster if you keep three catchers, because you need to give Davis a bunch of DH spots.
yeah.
Yeah.
And even if he's hitting well, like, I mean, you're not just going to play him 80 games at catcher and like, 4 or 5 at DH. Like, and then O'Neal Cruz, like he's coming off a pretty serious ankle injury and he's looked pretty good out there. But also, I mean, you want to protect that and give him some rest days.
You need somebody who can cover for him.
Yeah.
And because you're not gonna ride him like crazy to him play 160 games this year.
Yeah, and it's probably going to be Jared Triolo at this point in time. I would believe he's a guy that can bounce all over the field. Still should be the starting opening day second baseman, in my opinion. And we don't need to get into the just yet, but I would start him like 4 or 5 days a week and then bounce him around the other days. But I mean, yes, and then you got Brian Hayes, where you're trying to like he always comes up with little back injuries and stuff like that. So he's going to need some DH days. You might want to give Brian Reynolds some DH days, and at the end of that, like how much time is actually left at the DH spot for Andrew McCutchen? And like I said, I think we talked about this, Chris, before with oh God, who was it? It was like Carlton Fisk or somebody where they rode him off on a Harley or something.
Yeah,
Like Andrew
that's
McCutchen,
exactly what they did.
it's like
They did
Andrew
that.
McCutchen, like after you hit your 300th home run, like I want to see Cutch do that as a Pirates fan. Like,
Right. Then they give him a Harley, and he goes. That's it. That's exactly what they did. It's exactly what they did to Carlton Fisk in Chicago after his long career with the Red Sox, Hall of Fame career was in Chicago, and they were a young team, much like the Pirates. They were a team that was challenging for a postseason. I want to say it was '93. They actually won their division. That was the first time they won their division in 10 years, and he couldn't do very much anymore. But he was an idol. He was an icon. He was somebody the fan base would be upset with. So they just, in the middle of the summer, had a ceremony for him, called him the greatest catcher ever, gave him a Harley and like a Letterman jacket like you would get in high school, right? With like the leather sleeves with this White Sox, and they just told him now right off in the sunset, Carlton, and he rode off, and I think they locked the door behind him as soon as he pulled out into the street. Like that's how his career ended, right there on that day. Thank you very much for your service. Here's a Harley. You won't be in the lineup anymore. Take it easy, big guy.
yeah, and here's the say, it wasn't like McCutchen was he wasn't bad last year. The guy got on base, still had some power, some whatever. But
Right.
when you also want to get these young players, a decent amount of playing time, and it's for their development, I can't see how you can clog up a hole unless you're bringing in like a guy who is a DH. I mean, you could see Rowdy over there a couple of times where like he's not going to play first base every day, and if
Yeah.
he's hitting well, you're going to want to get him into the DH spot. That's a spot where unless you have like one of those like true DHs, a guy that's going to hit, and it could be terrible. It could hit like 215, but it's going to hit like 40 bombs and get on base a decent amount. But like the prototypical DH, but the Pirates aren't doing that. So I
No,
mean,
I think Kutch is making $5 million to play half a season. To get out of the gate quick like he did last year, and when it falls off, he'll be moved on. I think if he's a realistic person, he thinks that too. You
yeah,
know, I mean $5 million for a couple months' work. That's solid, and he deserves it after all he's done, and that's fine. I would be if you got guys challenging or he's not performing and he's still clogging things up. By all means, yell and scream in June and July. But I personally think this is like we're starting the season with him. He won't be there at the end of the season. I think if you look at any team, you see guys that start the season and aren't there at the end of the season. That's probably him. A guy that's going to be around for a long time. I know we only got a couple more minutes. Is Mitch Keller? I know you wanted to get into his contract.
yeah. And for Mitch Keller, I mean, the biggest thing is that I mean, like I said, I preempted it with kind of saying that he fell off towards the end of the year. I mean, his September and October numbers were actually better. His worst months were July and August, the dog days of summer. His ERA wasn't great in September, 5.28, but his WHIP was sitting around a 1.24. Obviously, was good in the first half. His overall numbers, I mean, if you look at it, he a lot of people will say, what was it, a 105 ERA plus, good. I mean, he's a good starting pitcher, and you could not. This is where, like, he had a good, what would be a full season of baseball from May 31st, 2022 through July 1st, 2023. I just want to throw out some numbers here: a 3.28 ERA, a 3.47 FIP, 225.1 innings, a 1.23 WHIP, 224 Ks, and then kind of wore out in the middle of the season, kicked it back into gear towards the end. You had to do this, and I liked that the Pirates did
Oh,
this.
it's a great deal. I don't know if I'd be so ecstatic about it if it weren't for the way that free agency went, but with a bad free agent class, look at the money that some guys are getting. Look at some of the guys who are just like subpar pitchers who are getting $10, $15 million a year. You got a guy who gave you nearly just under 200 innings with a whip under 1.30 at 1.245, I think, for the season, where he's keeping guys off base, and he was worth about 3 wins above replacement according to Fangraphs as a starting pitcher. And you've got a guy who's young enough that if he were able to get into the open market, is going to command, I think, more money by the time he gets in the open market than what he signed for. To me, that I signed that deal with Mitch Keller anytime, because at some point you got to spend money, and if you want to be a big boy team, you got to get that guy locked in. I was glad they did it.
Yeah, and I think that for the most part, that I mean, when Bob Nutting will open up, the purse strings, even if it's just a little bit, it's for guys that were, for the most part, developed here. I mean, I know Brian Reynolds came over from San Francisco, but was a hometown guy because they wanted to keep him here for the rest of his career, played his whole major league career here, and they're more likely to do it that way. I mean, the same thing, Brian Hayes, completely homegrown, Mitch Keller, completely homegrown, and they will do that for that. Like I said, I just wish they would do it just one time for a starting pitcher. I mean, there's guys that are still out there. This is kind of crazy that we're this far into spring training, and I mean, there's a decent amount of pitchers out there. We're obviously not going for the Montgomerys or the Snells, but there's definitely guys out there, and I would feel just so much better about this team if you had that. If you had that, because I mean, injuries are going to come up. I mean, you already have, injuries across the league. You see a Lucas Giolito. Sonny Gray right now, it looks like it's going to start the year on the IL. So, like, things that we're seeing as, like, really good signings, like, even sometimes those don't work out. I got David Bednar already dealing with a lat injury that they don't want to call a back injury, because then it'll just be like, well, he's got back injuries again. Well, he does have back problems. People that have back problems have chronic back problems. Somebody doesn't have back problems and then they go away and they never crop up again for the rest of their lives. So it's just frustrating. That's the only thing that's frustrating. I'm kind of like excited about the way things have been going, Chris. But it's just like when these little things creep in, when people like are like, why did Mitch Keller get paid? Or, oh, Paul Skenes is down in the minors, so it's all about this manipulation stuff. No, sometimes it's just about baseball.
No, it's about baseball. You got to make sure Skenes is pitching meaningful innings and doesn't tire out. And guess what? Bobby Witt Jr. in 2028 is making $30 million that year, with several more years after that where he's making $30 million. That $20 million, when you get the 28, is going to be a bargain. Trust me.